The day Jess Carter received the invitation was one she would never forget. It wasn't just any ordinary challenge. It came from the Zorani, a species known across the galaxy for their terrifying strength and martial skills. The Zorani were famous gladiators, dominating arenas on their home planet and across the stars. Their strength was legendary, their combat skills unmatched. And now, they had turned their gaze to Earth. Jess was just a wrestler, a human girl from a small town who had made a name for herself in the underground wrestling leagues. She was tough, relentless, and had never lost a match. But this was different. The Zorani had sent a formal invitation for Jess to face one of their finest warriors in an intergalactic exhibition match. It was going to happen in front of thousands of spectators from all over the galaxy, a mix of alien species who had never seen a human in action. The invitation itself was strange, written in a script Jess didn't recognize at first. A holographic display flickered to life when she touched the letter, revealing the alien language with a message translated for her. The Zorani challenge Earth's finest. You, Jess Carter, have been chosen. Meet Lyra, one of our greatest warriors, in a battle to determine if humans can withstand the might of the Zorani. The match is set. Will you answer the challenge? At first, Jess stared at the glowing message in disbelief. She knew who the Zorani were. Everybody did. Their species had visited Earth before, but only as spectators. Now, they wanted a real fight, and they wanted her. The thought of it excited her. There was no way she would back down. She had worked her entire life to get to this point. This was her chance to prove to the galaxy that humans were more than just small, fragile creatures. They were warriors too. But then there was the fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what it would mean to face a creature so much stronger, faster, and larger than herself. She had seen videos of Zorani gladiators, their powerful frames like living tanks, muscles bulging, their movements precise and deadly. And here she was, a regular human woman, being asked to take them on. But Jess wasn't the kind of person who backed down from a challenge. Not now, not ever. Of course I'll accept, she whispered to herself, clenching her fists with determination. She knew the road ahead would be brutal, but that didn't matter. She wasn't going to let her fear control her. This was the fight of a lifetime. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Jess began training harder than she ever had before. She didn't just want to be good. She wanted to be ready. She worked with her coach, a former wrestling champion, on her strength and agility. They focused on her speed and endurance, knowing that in a fight against a Zorani, sheer power wouldn't be enough. Jess would have to use her mind, her tactics, and her creativity to stay alive. Meanwhile, the world watched with bated breath. News outlets from all over the planet began reporting on the upcoming match. For the first time in history, a human was going to face a Zorani gladiator in a battle for honor and glory. Jess became a symbol of hope for humanity, a beacon of pride for every person who had ever dreamed of doing the impossible. But while Jess was getting ready, the Zorani warrior Lyra was also preparing. She was one of the best, a champion in her own right. Her muscles were like steel, and her agility, despite her size, was unmatched. She had never lost a fight in her life. Lyra was excited, but in her mind, this was going to be a short fight. She couldn't fathom how a human could be a real challenge. To her, this was just another easy win, something to pass the time before the next big fight. Still, even Lyra was intrigued. She had heard stories of human resilience. She had seen humans fight against creatures far stronger than themselves. But there was no way a human could stand up to the might of the Zorani. Days before the match, Jess received a final message from the Zorani. The match is set. You are expected to perform in front of a galactic audience. Prepare yourself. Lyra is waiting. Jess read the message again. There was no turning back now. She knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about showing the entire galaxy that humanity had what it took to stand on the same level as any other species. She had no idea what to expect when she stepped into the arena. But there was one thing Jess was sure of. She was ready. The day of the match finally arrived. Jess stood backstage, waiting for her turn to enter the arena. Her heart pounded in her chest, her muscles tense, but she was focused. She had trained for this moment her entire life. And now, here it was. She wasn't going to let fear take control. Today, she was going to show the galaxy what humanity was capable of. Outside, the roar of the crowd filled the air. Jess could hear the excited murmurs of the alien spectators, the different voices and sounds that filled the massive arena. Thousands of eyes were about to watch her fight a Zorani gladiator. She was about to step into the ring, not just as a wrestler, but as Earth's representative. The arena itself was huge, an open, circular space with glowing lights overhead, floating holograms showcasing the names of the combatants. Jess looked around as the door opened and a blinding light hit her face. She squinted against it, taking a deep breath before stepping out into the spotlight. The crowd fell silent for a moment, then erupted into cheers. The sight of a human, small, fragile-looking in comparison to the towering Zorani, was enough to make them pause in shock. Jess didn't care. She had no intention of letting their disbelief get to her. The audience had no idea what humans were capable of, but they were about to learn. Across the ring, Lyra stood waiting. Jess had seen her on holo recordings, and she had seen enough to understand the difference in size. Lyra was massive. Her body was a perfect example of Zorani strength, muscles bulging under her alien skin, her eyes glowing with confidence. She was easily twice Jess's size, but it wasn't just her size that made her dangerous. It was her reputation. Lyra had never lost a fight, and she wasn't about to start now. The two women stared at each other for a long moment. Jess felt her throat tighten, but she didn't look away. Lyra smiled, a cold, arrogant smile. She flexed her fingers as if the match was already won. Jess took a deep breath and centered herself, remembering everything she had learned in her training. She wasn't going to back down. The referee, a humanoid alien with 4 arms, raised his hands and called for the match to begin. The bell rang, and the crowd erupted into cheers once more. Lyra moved first. She charged at Jess with the speed and power of a freight train. Jess barely had time to react. The Zorani's massive fist swung toward her, and she ducked just in time, the air from Lyra's punch rushing past her face. Jess had always been quick, but facing an opponent this big and strong was a whole different challenge. Lyra roared in frustration, spinning to face Jess again, but Jess was already moving. She darted to the side, using the momentum from Lyra's failed attack to her advantage. Jess tried to grab Lyra's arm, aiming to take her down with a wrestling move, but Lyra was too strong. With one powerful jerk, Lyra freed herself, throwing Jess off balance. The crowd cheered wildly at the sight of Jess stumbling. Many of them probably thought the fight was already over. After all, how could a human compete with something like Lyra? But Jess wasn't done yet. She quickly regained her footing, eyes locked on Lyra, watching her every move. She had to be smart. Speed and agility. Those were her advantages. Lyra might be strong, but she couldn't move as fast as Jess. And Jess had one thing the Zorani didn't: strategy. Lyra lunged again, but this time, Jess was ready. She sidestepped just as Lyra's huge hand reached for her. The Zorani's fist crashed into the ground, sending dust flying into the air. Jess used the opening to grab Lyra's arm, twisting it in a way that forced the Zorani to bend. Lyra growled in frustration, but didn't give up. She threw her body backward, slamming Jess into the floor. Jess gasped as the wind was knocked out of her. The pain was sharp, but she pushed it away. She had to keep going. She couldn't let up for a second. Jess rolled to the side just in time to avoid another crushing blow from Lyra. She scrambled to her feet, eyes focused on the alien warrior. "You're quick, human," Lyra said with a sneer, "but that won't save you." Jess wiped the sweat from her brow, taking in the Zorani's words. She was getting exhausted, But she couldn't let Lyra see that. This wasn't just about strength. This was about survival. The crowd, sensing that the match might not go the way they expected, began to murmur. Some aliens were even cheering for Jess, surprised by how well she was holding up against their strongest fighter. Jess took a deep breath, watching as Lyra came at her again, faster this time. It was time to make a move. Jess waited for just the right moment. Then, with a quick movement, she dove toward Lyra's legs, sweeping them out from under the Zorani warrior. For a moment, everything slowed. Lyra's body twisted in the air as she fell. The crowd gasped, stunned. And then, with a loud crash, Lyra hit the ground, the arena shaking with the impact. Jess stood over her, chest heaving, a small but determined smile on her face. She had done it. She had knocked the Zorani down. The battle wasn't over yet, but Jess had made her first move, and it had landed. The arena was alive with noise. The crowd had erupted into a mix of gasps and cheers as Jess stood over the fallen Lyra, her breath coming in heavy gasps. Jess had done the unthinkable. She had knocked the Zorani warrior to the ground. It was a shocking moment. The spectators, mostly aliens from across the galaxy, had never seen anything like it before. A human, standing tall, while the Zorani lay on the floor, struggling to recover. But Jess didn't have time to celebrate. She knew better than to get cocky. She had only managed to take Lyra down with a quick move, and the Zorani's strength wasn't something to take lightly. She had seen enough of Lyra's power to know that this fight was far from over. Lyra was already starting to push herself up. Her alien skin glistened with a mixture of sweat and dust, and her eyes flashed with anger. She growled, her teeth gritted, as she slowly rose to her feet. The fall had shaken her, but Jess could see that Lyra was more determined than ever. If anything, it seemed to fuel her pride. Jess had made a mistake if she thought this was going to be easy. Lyra snarled, "You're quick, human, but you've only just begun to see what a real fighter looks like." Jess didn't reply. She couldn't. She was already moving again, her legs pumping as she backed away, preparing for the next strike. Lyra lunged at her, faster than Jess expected. The Zorani's massive arms reached for her with lightning speed, and Jess barely managed to dodge the first swing. The force of Lyra's punch sent a gust of air past her face, and Jess felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The next few moments were a blur. Jess darted left and right, staying just out of reach of Lyra's massive fists. She could feel the tension in her body, every muscle screaming in pain, but she pushed through. Her speed was her advantage, but the longer the fight went on, the harder it was to keep it up. Lyra was relentless, using her superior strength to close the gap every time Jess moved. Then, in the middle of the chaos, Jess felt it, a sudden shift in the air, a stinging sensation across her skin. At first, she thought it was just the pressure of the fight, but then it hit her all at once. Something was wrong. Lyra's sweat, something Jess hadn't thought about before, began to have an effect. It wasn't just the smell, a strange, sharp scent filling the air as Lyra's body released fluid from her pores. It was more than that. Jess could feel the energy drain from her legs growing heavy, her mind clouding with fatigue. Her head began to spin. It was like the very air around her was growing thicker, heavier. She staggered backward, her knees wobbling slightly. Jess tried to ignore it, but the effect was undeniable. Lyra's sweat, which was now splashing onto Jess's skin, was toxic. It wasn't a simple bodily fluid. It was an energy-sapping toxin, one that weakened anyone who came into contact with it. Jess tried to shake it off, but the sensation grew stronger. Her muscles were burning, her stamina draining away with every breath she took. The crowd, though still cheering, seemed to notice something was wrong. Their alien eyes observed with a mix of confusion and curiosity. They had never seen a human fight against a Zorani before, and certainly not one who seemed to be struggling. Lyra, sensing her opponent weakening, moved in for the kill. She grabbed Jess by the shoulder, spinning her around with a powerful twist. Jess barely managed to keep her balance, but it was getting harder. The fatigue was overwhelming. Every part of her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't give in. Not now. Not when she had come this far. "You're weak," Lyra taunted, her voice low and menacing. "You don't belong in this arena." Jess's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't afford to let Lyra's words get to her. She had to think. She had to survive. The thought of giving up wasn't even an option. She couldn't let humanity down. Lyra lunged again, faster than before, and this time, Jess wasn't quick enough. The Zorani's fist connected with her side, and the pain shot through Jess's body. She gasped, feeling the air rush out of her lungs, but she forced herself to keep moving. She staggered backward, her vision blurring. For a moment, Jess thought she might fall. But then something inside her clicked. She remembered why she was here. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for every human who had ever been told they were too small, too weak, too fragile to survive. She was fighting to show the universe that humans were a force to be reckoned with. With a burst of strength she didn't even know she had left, Jess ducked under Lyra's next punch and grabbed the Zorani's arm. She twisted it, using the momentum to pull Lyra off balance. The Zorani fighter stumbled, and for a moment, she was vulnerable. That was all Jess needed. She threw herself at Lyra, using every last ounce of energy she had to force the alien warrior to the ground. The crowd went silent as Lyra hit the mat with a massive thud. For a brief moment, Jess stood over her opponent, breathless, eyes wide. She had done it again. But the fight was far from over. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Jess stood, gasping for air, looking down at Lyra's massive form on the floor. The Zorani warrior was still, stunned by the sudden turn of events. Jess had done it again. She had knocked Lyra down. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Jess took a quick glance at the crowd. Their eyes were wide, mouths agape in disbelief. Even the aliens in the audience who had expected a quick victory for Lyra were now on the edge of their seats. Jess had managed to push the Zorani back twice, something no one had expected. They were watching a human outsmart and outlast one of the most feared warriors in the galaxy. But Jess couldn't let herself feel proud just yet. She felt the weight of exhaustion creeping up on her limbs heavy and aching. The toxic effect of Lyra's sweat had taken its toll, and with every second, it felt like her energy was slipping away. She had to finish this. She had to end the fight before it was too late. Lyra groaned, shifting slightly. The Zorani slowly pushed herself up, her alien eyes burning with fury. The brief moment of vulnerability had passed. Now she was back on her feet, and she was angrier than ever. Jess could see it in her eyes, the raw, primal rage of a warrior who had been humiliated. Lyra was no longer playing around. She was out for blood. "You're persistent, human," Lyra growled, wiping blood from the corner of her mouth. "But persistence won't save you." Jess didn't have time to respond. Lyra charged again, faster than Jess had ever seen. The Zorani moved with terrifying speed, closing the gap between them in an instant. Jess barely had time to react. She tried to dodge, but Lyra's fist connected with her shoulder, sending her crashing to the floor. The impact rattled her bones, and pain flared through her body. Jess winced, but didn't stay down. She rolled quickly, pushing herself back onto her feet. But the moment she stood, Lyra was already on her, grabbing her by the throat with one powerful hand. Jess gasped for air, her vision narrowing as Lyra's grip tightened. "You think you can beat me?" Lyra hissed, her voice low and threatening. "You're nothing but a bug beneath my heel." Jess's hands clawed at Lyra's wrist, trying to pry the Zorani's hand away. Her breathing became more shallow, and panic began to rise. The toxic sweat from Lyra's skin had drained more of her strength than she had realized. Her limbs felt numb, her vision blurred. Was this how it was going to end? No, Jess refused to give up. She wasn't going to let herself be defeated like this. The weight of the crowd's expectations, the pride of humanity, all of it pushed her forward. She needed a way out, a way to turn the fight around. As Lyra's grip tightened, Jess's mind raced. She couldn't overpower Lyra, not physically, but she didn't need to. She just needed to outthink her. Jess's eyes flicked down to Lyra's arm. The Zorani's hand was big, but it was also clumsy. There was a weak spot in Lyra's hold, a small opening if Jess could move fast enough. With a burst of energy, Jess twisted her body, slipping her arm under Lyra's. She used every ounce of strength to grab Lyra's wrist, pushing the hand that was choking her upward. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy her a few seconds. Jess took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air. Her heart pounded in her chest. And then, with all the force she could muster, Jess kicked Lyra's knee from the side. The blow wasn't strong enough to knock Lyra down, but it was enough to make the Zorani stumble. Jess used the moment of weakness to twist herself free, her feet landing solidly on the ground. Lyra let out a snarl and swung her fist toward Jess, but it was too slow. Jess dodged just in time, feeling the air rush past her. Her body was screaming in pain, but she forced herself to keep moving. She had to keep fighting. The crowd had erupted into cheers at Jess's daring escape. They were witnessing something extraordinary. No one had ever seen a human fight like this. Jess wasn't just surviving. She was taking the fight to the Zorani. And the Zorani warrior, for the first time, looked uncertain. Jess didn't give her opponent a chance to recover. She attacked with everything she had left, knowing that this might be her last chance. She aimed for Lyra's knees, using her speed to strike fast and hard. Lyra staggered backward, trying to regain her balance, but Jess kept the pressure on, moving relentlessly, not allowing the Zorani to regroup. Lyra's movements grew slower. Jess could see the cracks in the Zorani's confidence. The warrior was still dangerous, but she wasn't the unstoppable force she had been earlier in the fight. Jess's persistence, her will to survive, was starting to have an effect. Lyra was slowing down. The crowd saw it too. The energy in the arena shifted. For the first time, the balance of the fight was tipping in Jess's favor. But Jess knew she couldn't stop now. She had to finish what she had started. Jess could feel the heat of the battle in her bones. Every movement, every breath was an effort now. Her body ached, the exhaustion from the toxic sweat, the bruises, and the fight itself weighing down on her like a lead anchor. But there was no choice. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she had come this far. Lyra, though still towering over her, was showing signs of fatigue as well. The Zorani's once unstoppable speed had slowed. Her movements weren't as precise, her attacks less relentless. The human fighter had given her more than she had ever expected, and the shock of that was beginning to take its toll. For a moment, the two warriors stood facing each other, locked in a silent, tense standoff. Jess's heart hammered in her chest. She was breathing hard, but she was alive. And as long as she had breath, she could still fight. Lyra's alien eyes narrowed as she sized Jess up. The Zorani's heavy breathing echoed in the stillness of the arena, but there was no more arrogance in her gaze. She was no longer sure of herself. Jess had made her doubt, had made her struggle, and that was enough to give Jess the edge. The crowd seemed to sense it too. The alien spectators, who had once laughed at the idea of a human winning, were now on the edge of their seats. Some of them were even cheering for Jess, something that was almost unheard of in the history of intergalactic combat. A human was holding her own against one of the fiercest fighters in the galaxy. Against all odds, Jess had turned this match into a battle of willpower. Lyra grunted and lunged forward, a primal roar escaping her throat. She was charging at Jess with every bit of her remaining strength, determined to end this once and for all. Jess's reflexes kicked in. She dodged to the left, barely escaping the swipe of Lyra's massive fist, but she didn't stop there. She spun around and aimed a quick jab at Lyra's side, targeting the same spot she had hit earlier. The blow landed, and Jess saw Lyra flinch. The Zorani warrior staggered, her knees buckling for a second. Jess wasn't sure if it was the pain from the strike or the exhaustion finally catching up with Lyra, but she knew this was her moment. The warrior was vulnerable. Jess moved like lightning, her body acting on instinct. She rushed forward, grabbing Lyra by the arm and using all the momentum she had left to spin the Zorani around. With a forceful twist, Jess used Lyra's own weight against her, throwing her to the ground once again. The impact was deafening. Lyra's body hit the mat with a loud thud, shaking the entire arena. For a split second, everything went still. The crowd gasped, waiting to see if Lyra would rise. But Jess didn't wait. She wasn't giving the Zorani a chance to recover. Not this time. She dove on top of Lyra, securing a strong hold on the larger woman's arm. Lyra tried to fight back, her strength still formidable, but Jess was faster, more determined. She twisted Lyra's arm, using every ounce of her strength to keep her opponent on the ground. The Zorani growled and struggled, but Jess held firm, her grip tightening with each passing second. "Give up, Lyra," Jess said, her voice barely a whisper, but the words carried through the silence. "You've lost." Lyra's eyes flickered with fury, but Jess could see the exhaustion in them. Her breathing was labored, and the fire that had once burned so brightly in her gaze was now dimming. The fight had drained her more than she had expected. Jess had outlasted her. But just as Jess thought she might have won, Lyra let out one last roar and summoned what little strength she had left. With a final surge of power, she attempted to throw Jess off, trying to break free from the hold. But it was too late. Jess had already secured her position. The referee, watching closely from the sidelines, saw the moment of truth. With a loud, clear voice, he called out, "Victory to the human." The crowd exploded into cheers, their roars shaking the arena. Jess, still on top of Lyra, stared down at her opponent, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. It was over. She had done it. She had beaten the Zorani. Lyra lay on the mat, her face flushed with anger and exhaustion, but there was no denying the truth. Jess had outfought her. The human had triumphed. For a moment, Jess simply sat there, taking it all in. The noise from the crowd was deafening, but it didn't matter. She had achieved what no one thought possible. A human had defeated one of the galaxy's most feared warriors. As Jess stood, her knees wobbling slightly, she looked out over the crowd. Alien faces filled with disbelief and admiration stared back at her. She raised her hand in victory, and the cheers only grew louder. The humans in the audience, who had been quietly rooting for her, were now shouting her name, celebrating her triumph. Jess couldn't help but smile, the weight of the fight lifting from her shoulders. She had just shown the galaxy that humanity was not to be underestimated. She was small, she was human, and yet she had just proven that no one was more determined than a human fighting for their life. The universe would never forget the name of Jess, Earth's first warrior to defeat a Zorani in the arena. The arena was still buzzing with excitement, but for Jess, the adrenaline rush was starting to fade. Her victory over Lyra, the Zorani warrior, had been nothing short of miraculous. She had pushed her body beyond its limits, fought through the pain, and come out on top. The cheers of the crowd were like a distant echo in her ears now. She was exhausted, every muscle sore, and her body begged for rest. But the moment she stood up after her victory, she felt something else, the weight of what came next. The fight with Lyra was over, but Jess could feel eyes on her from every corner of the arena. The crowd had stopped chanting her name, but something new was in the air, an expectation. Her victory had turned her into a symbol, and Jess wasn't sure if she was ready for that. She walked to the edge of the arena, her legs wobbly but determined. She could hear the whispers from the other competitors. They were all aliens, towering over her in height and strength, and their eyes were filled with curiosity, respect, and maybe a little fear. Jess wasn't sure which one scared her more. Behind her, Lyra was still on the mat, slowly getting to her feet. Her face was bruised, her pride shattered, but there was a fire in her eyes. Lyra may have lost, but the Zorani wasn't finished. Jess knew it. A booming voice echoed from the speakers above the arena, and Jess turned to see the towering figure of the announcer. "The battle has ended, but the fight continues," the announcer declared. "The humans have proven themselves stronger than we ever imagined. But this victory, it's only the beginning. There are more challenges ahead." Jess frowned, feeling the weight of those words settle deep in her chest. More challenges. What did that mean? Before she could react, the announcer's voice continued. "A new challenger approaches. Behold, the champion of the Vroxians." The crowd roared. Jess's heart skipped a beat as a new figure entered the arena. This one wasn't like the others. The Vroxian warrior was a massive creature, easily twice the size of Jess, and almost as large as Lyra. Its skin was a tough, rock-like gray, covered in scars from countless battles. Its face was fierce, its eyes cold, and its body was a mass of muscle. The Vroxian's every step shook the ground beneath him. Jess's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected this. She had just fought the most powerful fighter she had ever met. And now, here was someone even bigger and more terrifying. The Vroxians were known across the galaxy for their brutal strength and ruthless fighting style. Jess had heard the stories. None of them were good. The Vroxian stepped forward, his large hands clenching into fists. He stood in the center of the arena, glaring at Jess. His deep, gravelly voice echoed through the stadium. "You were lucky to defeat the Zorani," the Vroxian growled. "But you won't be so lucky with me." Jess felt a chill run down her spine. She had just fought one of the fiercest warriors in the galaxy, but this new challenger was something else entirely. The Vroxian wasn't just strong. He was a fighter who had likely never lost. Jess wasn't sure if she had the strength left to fight again, but she had no choice. If she wanted to keep proving humanity's worth, she had to face him. The crowd was silent, waiting for Jess to make her move. Her body screamed for rest, but there was no time. She could feel the weight of every alien eye on her, waiting to see if she could pull off another impossible victory. She knew she couldn't back down now, not when the universe was watching. Jess clenched her fists, taking a deep breath. "Bring it on," she muttered, trying to sound confident, even though doubt clawed at the back of her mind. The Vroxian grinned, his sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light of the arena. "This is your last chance, human. Don't say I didn't warn you." Jess's mind raced as she took her stance. Her body was screaming for relief, but there was no way out now. She would have to dig deep, push past the pain, and do whatever it took to survive. The Vroxian was big, stronger than Lyra, but Jess had one thing he didn't: her humanity. She might not have the same raw power, but she had the will to fight, and that had been enough to win the first round. The Vroxian charged, his massive legs pounding the ground. Jess barely had time to react, but her instincts kicked in. She ducked, feeling the rush of air as the Vroxian's fist passed just above her head. She darted to the side, but the Vroxian was quick. He swung again, his fist connecting with Jess's side before she could fully dodge. Pain exploded in her ribs, and Jess gasped. She stumbled, but she didn't fall. She couldn't afford to fall now. The crowd held its breath as Jess fought to stay upright, her vision blurring from the impact. She had to recover fast. The Vroxian's next move came with lightning speed. Jess wasn't sure if she could keep dodging much longer, but she didn't have a choice. She had to find a way to turn this around before it was too late. The pain in Jess's side was sharp, and she felt her breath catch as she stumbled. The Vroxian was massive, faster than she'd expected, and every blow felt like it could crush her. Her body was already drained from the battle with Lyra, but she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. The Vroxian's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he saw Jess falter. He knew he had her on the ropes, and he wasn't going to let up. He charged again, his fists swinging like wrecking balls. Jess barely had time to react. She dodged, but not fast enough. The Vroxian's fist connected with her shoulder, sending a jolt of pain down her arm. Jess fell to one knee, gasping for air, her vision blurred, and the sound of the crowd seemed muffled, as if she were underwater. The world felt distant, but she could still hear the Vroxian's mocking voice. "You're strong, human, but not strong enough," he growled, towering over her. "You can't win this. You're just a tiny, fragile creature compared to me." Jess's chest tightened. His words stung, but they also lit a spark inside her. She was small, and she was fragile, but she wasn't weak. She had made it this far. She had defied every expectation. She had beaten Lyra, a Zorani warrior who was feared across the galaxy. Why couldn't she beat this Vroxian? The crowd's murmurs grew louder, watching Jess struggle, waiting for the inevitable. But Jess wasn't done yet. She could feel the weight of humanity's pride on her shoulders. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. With a deep breath, Jess forced herself back to her feet. Her body screamed in protest, but she silenced it. She had no choice. The Vroxian was already lunging at her again, his massive body charging like a freight train. But this time, Jess didn't retreat. Instead, she surged forward. With the last of her strength, Jess ducked beneath the Vroxian's arm, twisting to the side. She slid past him, her movements fueled by sheer will. The Vroxian's massive arm swung wide, missing her by mere inches. Jess saw her opportunity and seized it. She darted forward, slamming her shoulder into his ribs. The impact wasn't enough to knock him down, but it was enough to stagger him. The Vroxian grunted, turning quickly to face her. But Jess was already moving again, faster now, using her agility to outpace his slower, heavier movements. She didn't have the strength to overpower him, but she had something else: speed and the ability to think in the heat of battle. Jess made a feint to the left, drawing the Vroxian's attention. He swung at her, but she dodged, and this time she saw the opening. As the Vroxian's right arm swept past, Jess dove beneath his arm, grabbing his massive wrist and yanking it downward with all her might. She used her legs to push off the ground, forcing herself up onto the Vroxian's back. For a moment, everything went still. Jess could feel the Vroxian's muscles tense beneath her, but she wasn't going to let go. She wrapped her legs around his body, locking him in place. Her hands worked quickly to grip the back of his head, pulling him down in a move she had practiced on Earth, but never expected to use in a fight like this. The Vroxian howled in rage, trying to throw her off, but Jess held on tight, using every bit of her strength to keep him down. She twisted his head, not enough to break his neck, but just enough to cause him pain. The Vroxian's body started to slow, his strength fading as the pressure on his neck built. The crowd gasped. Jess wasn't supposed to be able to do this. She wasn't supposed to be able to defeat him. But she was, and she could see the shock in the Vroxian's eyes as he realized that she had outsmarted him, that her persistence and speed had defeated his raw power. With a final grunt, the Vroxian collapsed to his knees, his hands reaching to pull Jess off him. But it was too late. Jess held on one last time, twisting his head just enough to force him into submission. The Vroxian let out a final growl of frustration before he fell forward, unable to continue. The crowd fell silent, staring in disbelief. For a moment, it seemed like the world had stopped. And then the announcer's voice rang out, clear and loud across the arena. "Victory to the human." The stadium erupted in cheers, louder than anything Jess had ever heard. She felt a rush of relief and pride as the noise filled her ears. She had done it. She had beaten the Vroxian. Her body shook with exhaustion, and she staggered back, nearly collapsing from the weight of the battle. But she stayed on her feet. She had proven something today, not just to the galaxy, but to herself. She was a human, and no matter how strong or fast the aliens were, humanity had something they couldn't defeat: willpower. As Jess raised her hand in victory, she looked out at the sea of alien faces. Some were cheering, others stunned into silence, but all of them were watching her. She had just shown them what humanity was capable of, and no one would forget it. The universe had learned a hard lesson today. Never underestimate the strength of the human spirit.